Good morning. So good to be together here this morning and also with those who are continuing to Zoom in with us. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting here in central Indiana on land that was taken from the nations of Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, and Potawatomi based on the white supremacist assumption that God was okay with that. We'll be touching on this more later in the message. We've been busy in our family this week with our grandson Jacob having his 11th birthday, Bethany and Josh having their 15th anniversary, and Jeannie and my 5th anniversary. And Jeannie and I participated in the Indiana-Michigan Mennonite Conference sessions on Friday and yesterday at Amigo Center in Michigan. We also celebrated Juneteenth yesterday, and we'll look at that more later in the message. I want to publicly thank Jeannie for 5 wonderful years of partnership together. And I want to thank all of you of Shalom for your part in nurturing and supporting the growth of our relationship before and since that time. Some of you will remember our wedding 5 years ago, yesterday, when we had a big white tent outside for our big thank you party. It was a day that we will always remember with great joy. When I was asked several weeks ago to bring the message today, I soon realized that June 20th is not just an average Sunday. It is Father's Day. It is the day after Juneteenth and the day after Indiana-Michigan Annual Conference. And it has been a year since we committed ourselves to being an active, persistent, anti-racist congregation. So it has been challenging to find a way to blend some of those themes together in a message which will be relevant to where we are at Shalom right now on our journey together. I have struggled a lot in preparing this message, but I believe that it is what God wants us to look at this morning. In the scripture which Jeannie just read from Luke 4, we have one of the most important statements Jesus made about the purpose and mission of his life here on earth. In this wonderful human enterprise God has going on our little planet Earth. Jesus said God's Spirit was calling him to let the oppressed go free and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Throughout Jesus' ministry, he challenged people who dealt with others in oppressive ways, religious, social, or political. But Jesus went beyond looking at individual behavior to address the social structures that oppressed people. He reached out to tax collectors, Gentiles, that would be us, the sick and disabled, the mentally ill, Samaritans, and anyone who his society considered less than fully human. One part of the commitment that we have made as a congregation toward being an active and persistent anti-racist congregation is lifelong learning about the history and continuing impact of racism. Today, on the day after Juneteenth, we have an opportunity to recognize, as part of our history, where Juneteenth came from and what it means. As you probably know, the Civil War ended when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses Grant in Virginia on April 9, 1865. But Confederate leaders in the South tried to keep this news from reaching enslaved people for as long as possible. It was not until 2 months later, on June 19th, that the Union General Gordon Granger told enslaved people in Galveston, Texas, that their oppression had ended. That freedom is what we celebrated yesterday on Juneteenth. And just this week, President Biden signed a new law passed overwhelmingly by Congress, which makes Juneteenth now a federal holiday in all 50 states. As we think today about how the ministry of Jesus brought liberation for the oppressed of his day, and the end of slavery in the United States expanded freedom here, I think we need to also look at how white supremacist racism has brutalized the life of people of color in our country and restricted their opportunities for development. I want to share with you a little slice of that racism by looking in some detail at the experiences of 4 couples in the United States. There is going to be some hard, painful, and graphic material in these 4 stories. But I think that it's important for us as committed anti-racists to face these realities and to try to imagine being in the frame of mind of the persons who were the victims of this racism. The couples I want to reflect on are Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, J.I. and Eva Pitts, William and McInnes, Connor, and Mildred and Richard Loving. First, Jefferson and Hemings. Thomas Jefferson is often considered one of the most important founders of our nation. He wrote the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." But it is estimated that Thomas Jefferson enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime on his plantation at Monticello, Virginia. Among those he enslaved was Sally Hemings, who came to Monticello as a toddler with her mother and brother as part of an inheritance from Jefferson's wife, Martha. From 1787 to 1789, the widowed Jefferson was in Paris as ambassador to France for the newly created United States of America. Living with Jefferson in Paris were his 12 and 15-year-old daughters and their 14-year-old maidservant, Sally Hemings. The first time Thomas Jefferson sexually assaulted Sally Hemings in Paris, he was 45 years old and she was either 14 or 15. Try to imagine yourself inside the mind of Sally Hemings in that horrific situation. Can we begin to understand the fear, anger, outrage, and betrayal she must have felt while being sexually exploited by one of the most powerful white men on earth, who would soon become the 3rd president of the United States? Jefferson, on the other hand, not only thought that his behavior was okay, he thought he had a right to do what he was doing with what he perceived as his property. Slavery at that time was already illegal in France. It is estimated that there were a community of at least 1,000 free black persons living in Paris then. Did Sally Hemings know that? Did she ever consider or attempt to run away from Jefferson and join them? We'll never know. But we do know that when the Jefferson household returned to Monticello in Virginia in 1789, 16-year-old Sally Hemings was pregnant with Jefferson's child. From her nearly powerless position, she did get Jefferson to promise that he would free any of their children from slavery on their 21st birthday. Before age 25, Sally Hemings had borne 4 of Jefferson's children, and 3 of them had died. Imagine for a moment the grief that young Sally Hemings had to work through with each of those 3 deaths, along with all the other challenges she faced in her enslaved life. It seems almost more than any of us could bear. Although Hemings remained enslaved until Thomas Jefferson's death, Jefferson did keep his promise to liberate their 4 adult children when each of them turned 21. Hemmings had reluctantly exchanged her body and her life for the liberation of her children. Jefferson was conflicted about slavery. In his book called Notes on Virginia, regarding slavery, he wrote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever." After Jefferson died, Sally Hemings was permitted to leave Monticello to live out her last days with two of her adult sons in Charlottesville. That's the same Charlottesville where 3 years ago there was a white supremacist riot because a statue of Robert E. Lee was going to be taken down. Our founder, Thomas Jefferson's white supremacist racism, is still with us. Next, I want to focus briefly on J.I. and Eva Pitts. J.I. was a black man farming cotton with his white wife, Eva Pitts, near Roswell, New Mexico in the early 1900s. They wanted to have a bigger farm, and they heard that land could be gotten at a reasonable price near the Texas town of Toya, about 180 miles east of where they were living. What they didn't know was that that part of Texas had been declared off limits for anyone but white people. As soon as the Pitts got off the train in Toya, they were confronted promptly by local people, referred to only in the local newspaper as a mob of cowboys. These hostile new neighbors told the Pitts that they would need to leave town soon because black people were not allowed there, especially living with a white person. The Pitts found overnight accommodations, and the next day were looking to buy land. When word got out that the Pitts were still around, the cowboys organized a violent response. In the middle of the next night, several hundred cowboys came to the place where the Pitts were staying, surrounded the house, and invaded the Pitts' bedroom. They announced that it was time for J.I. Pitts to die. J.I. and Eva pleaded for their lives, saying that they would leave town the next day on the first train in the morning. The leaders of the mob said that time has passed and that they were going to give J.I., quote, what he deserved, unquote. The leading cowboy slipped his lasso around J.I.'s neck. They then pulled him out of bed and out of the house. With the rope attached to a galloping horse, they dragged J.I. until he died. Using the same rope, they hanged him from a telephone pole and celebrated their defending of white honor in Texas. Back at the house, part of the mob gave the horrified and grieving widow, Eva Pitts, money for a train ticket to leave town the next morning, and she did. J.I. Pitts' only offense was that he was a black man who loved his wife and wanted to be their friendly new neighbor. This happened in the same Texas where Juneteenth was celebrated 41 years earlier. It didn't matter to the Texas Cowboys that just 60 years earlier, that area was part of Mexico before it was stolen by the United States in 2 wars. All of the people who have lived there had been Mexican citizens wanting to be peaceful neighbors of their newly created neighbor, the United States of America. This is also the same Texas where right now many new laws are being passed to make it harder for people of color to vote. J.I. Pitts was one of at least 4,743 documented lynchings in the United States since 1882. Some would argue that the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery last year were modern-day lynchings because we are still killing black people without any justification. The third couple I want to focus on in our journey this morning are William and Macungus Connor. William Connor was born in Ohio and came in 1800 to what became Indiana. Early on, Connor was a fur trader with the indigenous Delaware nation living in this area. He was fluent in 7 languages and a very skilled communicator, and he used that to his full advantage as more white people moved into this area. William Connor lived among and traded with the Delaware nation. He became so close to the indigenous Delaware chief, William Anderson, that he married his daughter, Macungus, in 1802. Connor soon became less interested in furs and more interested in acquiring land through the relationships he had developed with the Delaware. Among his acquisitions was a 1,000-acre farm on the banks of the White River, which we now call Connor Prairie Museum. William and Macungus Connor had 6 children between 1803 and 1820. William was actively involved in the War of 1812 as a scout and language interpreter. That war is remembered mostly as a fight with Britain, who attacked our eastern coast and destroyed our capital in Washington. But the war had a devastating impact on indigenous people living in the Midwestern part of our country. After the war, William Connor was involved as an interpreter in multiple coercive negotiations, which resulted in the Miami, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Delaware nations giving up all of their land in what became the state of Indiana. In 1820, the last of the Delaware, including William Connor's wife and 6 children, were forced to march from the newly created state of Indiana to the so-called Indian Territory in Oklahoma. It's hard to imagine what conflicts there must have been in Connor's mind and difficult conversations that did or should have happened in the Connor family as that time approached. What was he thinking? What did he say to his wife and to their children? How much did they understand about what was happening to them? How could they cope with their feelings of betrayal, abandonment, and anger when they did understand? It's hard to fathom the cruelty and inhumanity of it all. How can we even think about such betrayal on Father's Day? The fourth and last couple I want us to focus on today are Mildred and Richard Loving. Richard was white and Mildred was black. Both grew up in Caroline County, Virginia in the 1950s and fell in love in high school. At that time, Virginia and 30 other states said that interracial marriage was a crime. In Virginia, the punishment was 1 to 5 years in prison. So Mildred and Richard went to Washington, D.C. to have a legal wedding. Several weeks after they returned home to Virginia, one night in the middle of the night, the police raided their home and charged them with violating Virginia's marriage law. The case was called Loving versus Virginia. The state of Virginia was against people of different races loving each other. In court, the Lovings were found guilty and were given a sentence of 1 year in prison. The sentence was suspended while they appealed their decision, and on appeal, the United States Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision 54 years ago this week, said that the United States Constitution guarantees everyone the right to marry whomever they choose. The Lovings celebrated their courage, patience, and persistence in challenging this racist law and striking it down forever. And incidentally, 6 years ago, also this week, the Supreme Court extended that decision to say that the Constitution guarantees the right to same-sex marriage. We began this message today looking at the good news that Jesus brought while he was here on earth in liberating the oppressed. We looked at the celebration of Juneteenth in Texas, as many oppressed people were liberated from 254 years of U.S. slavery. We've looked at a few families who have suffered severely because of racism in the United States. We need to remember that over the last 400 years, millions and millions of individuals and families have struggled for survival and dignity in the face of vicious and cruel racism. So, what can we say about parenting on Father's Day that is much more positive than Thomas Jefferson enslaving his own children and William Connor betraying and abandoning his? We can say a lot in a few words. My own situation, I'm eternally grateful that my dad, Alva Yoder, and my mom, Ruth Aish, created a mutual partnership to nurture my sister, two brothers, and me during our growing up years. Dad's primary work was farming and Mom's was teaching. In addition to farming, Dad was also deacon of the Springs, Pennsylvania Mennonite Church. Deacon at that time was an ordained lifetime position which included responsibilities for addressing the financial and emotional needs of members, ministering to residents of our local county jail, and resolving interpersonal conflict which developed within the congregation. Out of that and my mom's teaching came the foundation for my career of practicing and teaching social work and criminal justice. Each of my parents were mentors and role models for me in their own ways. Parenting responsibilities in my family of origin were always shared in a flexible way with no presumptions about husbands, fathers, wife, mothers, and what they should do. I will always be grateful for that. It was always clear to us that our parents respected and loved each other and loved and respected each of us children. Words were important in our family. We talked a lot and we learned to listen well. We were encouraged to ask lots of questions. I don't remember ever feeling in the dark about anything that really mattered in our family. In the family that my deceased wife Marilyn and I created with our three daughters, we tried to pass on and expand what we had been given from our parents. As Jeannie and I have blended our families together, we continue to learn and to grow from each individual and each family. I will always consider being a parent a sacred privilege. I have learned so much from our children and grandchildren about what is important in life. It is a rewarding adventure as we invest time and energy with the gift of every day. If we were to know all of the experiences that members of our congregation have had with fathers, I imagine that there might be quite a variety, from some very positive to some pretty negative, maybe some rather absent, and some still happening. I want to invite you to take some time later today to reflect on what you are carrying with you from your experiences with fathers or father role models. If you have had negative experiences or your father has been absent physically or emotionally, acknowledge that openly to yourself or to someone else. Recognize the disappointment or pain or anger and the grief that go with the experience of your unfulfilled hopes and unmet needs. And with the positive experiences you have had with men in your life, be grateful. Celebrate the emotional gifts that have been given to you. If they're still living, tell them in your own way how much they mean to you. And as opportunities come your way, pass on the respect, hope, and love that have been given to you. I think God will be glad that you did. You pray with me. God, we thank you for the gift of life and the gift of this day. We thank you for being the source of all love, and that you have let us know through your Son and our brother, Jesus of Nazareth, how much you love us. You continuously reach out to us to be in a loving relationship with you and with each other. We confess that sometimes we don't live up to our calling. There have been times within the human family we have done horrible things to each other. Forgive us for our blindness and our cruelty to each other. We want your love to be reflected in how we live. Help us to see your image in every other person and to live in ways which draw that out in our everyday lives. Today we remember the liberation Jesus brought to those who were oppressed in his time, and we celebrate the ending of the oppression of millions of people of African descent for 256 years in the United States. Today we also recognize the men who have been important in our lives. We ask you to forgive and to set free the negative experiences that may have been a part of these relationships. We celebrate the positive gifts that have come to us through these men. May we pass these on to the next generation as the living presence of your work on our little planet Earth. Amen.